Welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to make our Hangry Prints application shine. This is going to be awesome. So what we're going to do is mostly we're going to do some Sass/CSS stuff because we want to take a little break from the JavaScript. So relax a little bit, turn off your logical programming mind, and let's turn on our artistic, creative, sort of fun, styling presentation minds. And we're going to talk about how we can improve our accordion even more. We're also going to go back and revisit the tabs and improve the presentation of that a bit as well. And it's gonna be a fun exercise. I think I really love CSS stuff, and hopefully you guys will get some use out of this. You can sort of see how we can really improve our accordion, which right now is pretty jumpy. When I open the panels and close them, it's very jumpy. There's not a lot of interactivity feel to it. It is functional. You know, you could say, oh, that's good, it works, but there's so much more we can do with this. CSS is your friend. You can really take something from functional to, wow, that's really cool with CSS. And that's what I want to do. I want to add the cool factor in this lesson. So let's see if we can do that. So the first thing I want to do is with our accordion, we have this plus icon over here, which is clickable. It's part of the anchor header that you see up here. And currently in our CSS, we're sort of moving it over to the right. And you can see how we're doing that is the anchor itself is display flex. And if you've never used Flexbox, it's a way to you can do columns with it, you can do rows, it's a way you can do all sorts of layout stuff. But by doing justify content space between, you see this style right here, it allows us to move this accordion icon over to the right. And you can see when I uncheck it and check it, the effect that has. So that's kind of the method that we're using to move the accordion icon over here. And then the accordion icon itself just has a color on it right now. There's not much to it. It's basically just kind of using that Flexbox thing to move it over to the right. But what we can do is I think the first thing that might really improve the usability and the presentation of this accordion would be to make the plus rotate 45 degrees whenever this link is open. So we can do that because we have this aria expanded attribute on our accordion header anchor link. And then whenever that is set to true, we can do a transform on this, and it's going to look like this. We'll just do transform, rotate 45 degrees, and you'll see that turns it into an X. But we don't want to do that directly in the tools here. I want to do that inside of our style sheet, so it can actually rotate automatically based on the presence of aria expanded. So let's do that. We'll jump into Visual Studio Code. Let's close this JavaScript file. We don't want JavaScript. Get out of here, JavaScript. We're doing some fun CSS stuff, and we're gonna add. Let's go. Oh, we already have a place here where we have accordion icon. So that's where we're setting the color there. And if I scroll up a little bit more, here's our accordion header, and there is our anchor tag. Right. So what we want to say is when the anchor tag has an attribute of aria expanded equals true, then we want to do something to it. Right? So that means it's expanded, we're ready to do something, and so then we could just simply say, take your accordion icon, transform, just like we did in the dev tools, and rotate 45 degrees, like so. And then when we save that, you'll see over here, the icon actually rotates and turns into an X every time I open it. But it's still pretty jumpy, so we can simply add a transition to the accordion icon to transition its transform property between states. So that means that down here in our accordion icon, we're going to set transition transform 0.3 seconds ease, something like that. So you see that adds a bit of an animation to our X there, which makes it feel a little more smooth. I think that gives it a nice feel to it, and that is working great. So that's an easy addition. Turn your pluses into X's. That's a great thing to add to a toggle, especially to an accordion. In my opinion, I think it's cool. You could also have a plus that turns into a minus. That's something I see a lot, or like a little caret or an arrow that points to the right and then it points down whenever the panel's open. That's another thing I've seen a lot. All kinds of stuff you could do, but usually rotation is a good way to do that. I'm sure there's other styles as well, but that's a good indication to the user as to how this particular feature functions. Another thing we could maybe do is maybe whenever it's open, we could color the heading, the question up here, and you'll notice this has a span with a class of accordion question. So maybe what we can do is also when it's open here, we can take the accordion question and let's take away the text decoration. So you'll see that takes away the little underline there whenever it's open. So it kind of looks like a link when it's not open. And then when you open it, it takes that underline away. And then maybe also for the anchor itself, we'll color that primary whenever it's open to make it highlighted. So you can see when it's open, it's now going to turn green to indicate that it's open. Just kind of giving the user a nice indication as to the state of each heading, because they kind of run into each other a bit. I've seen a lot of people when they do accordions, you could do like borders and stuff around them to make it feel like one component. That's certainly an option. If you wanted to do something like that, you would just maybe change the padding to be like 510 and then add a border 1 pixel solid lighter maybe. And you'll see it kind of adds a border around each one. And then you would probably want to continue that border. We'd probably want to take the margin off of here, and you would continue that border onto the accordion panel itself. So we would probably want to change its padding to, what did we do up here? 510, let's do 10, 15, and then down here for the accordion panel, we'll do 25. 15 pixels, 10 pixels, 25 pixels, and then it'll do down the right. So, whoops, that's padding bottom. We want that to be padding all the way around. There we go. So you can see it just kind of puts the panel itself in a little box as well to make it all feel a little more connected. That's certainly something you could do. But you may notice here that there's a double border between each one of these. So we can fix that by basically, let's just set on all of these border top is going to be 0 on the panel, and then on the anchor tag itself, we'll set border top to 0 as well. So now we have a single border between all of them, which looks nicer, but now we have a missing border on the very top. So we'll simply set the top of the accordion. We'll add a border there as well. And there we go. Everything's kind of contained now. It looks a little bit more like it's like all one component. That's totally optional. You know, you don't have to do the borders, but it's definitely something that people may do from time to time if you are building out an accordion. And then you could do, you know, some interesting stuff, like maybe instead of changing the color, you could do background color primary, color lightest. So you could really like make the active headers pop if you wanted to. That's another thing you could certainly do to just give this all sorts of different styles. But I don't think we need to do that at the moment. We'll just leave it a pretty simple style, and you could sort of see what we're going for here. I think it looks decent at the moment. And I would even say, since we added the border, we don't the underline is kind of overkill. So we'll just take this text decoration none, and we'll just add it to. Oh, you know what? I had this section down here that was adding the text decoration, so let's just take that out. And then so now we just have kind of it looks a little simpler, I think. I think if you have the borders, you probably shouldn't have text decoration. It's just adding too many lines, in my opinion. But I think this is looking pretty good at this point. Cool. So we added our little X. We added some borders around our accordion. The next thing I want to do is let's eliminate the pop. It is popping big time. It's very harsh whenever those panels appear, isn't it? So what we're going to do is we're going to create sort of an entry animation that's going to allow us to sort of, rather than immediately showing the accordion panel whenever it appears, I want it to kind of grow in. So we could create a grow in animation, if you will, that will allow that transition to be a lot less harsh. So let's take a look at that. Inside of our SAS folder over here, let's create a new file. We'll call it effects.scss. I usually like to make these reusable when I'm doing these effects, and we kind of did this in a previous lesson, but I didn't mention much about it. But what we'll do in here is we will create a grow in animation. So we're going to use keyframes grow-in. That'll be what we call it. And that'll, let's do this a couple different ways. Let's start with a simple one. We'll start with one that starts at opacity 0. And actually, we don't even need opacity. We can do transform scale Y. So this might be one method that you use to do this. You could use a transform and scale on the Y-axis. This is the easiest way to do it. You can scale from 0 to at 100% transform scale Y1. So it's going to go from 0 height transform to full height transform. And then we can just create a little utility class. So anytime you add the grow in class to anything, we'll do animation. There we go. Grow in 0.3 seconds ease. And now that we've added this class, we need to make sure that this effects.sass is actually loaded. So in our app.scss, let's add an import for effects, like so. So now that will be loaded. And then finally, in our HTML, every time we have an accordion panel, so let me select all the instances of that. You can see the little yellow lines. I have multiple cursors here. On each one of those, we'll add grow-in. And now you can sort of see the effect that that has. So there's still a lot of pop-in, which is why even though this is the easiest method, I probably wouldn't do this because a transform does not change the layout of the content. So what's happening if we open our animations panel down here and we slow it down to 25%, you'll see that as soon as I open it, it takes up the full height of that content, but it's actually animating using a transform. Even though that content is taking up its normal height, it's animating its height, but it doesn't animate like the layout of that. Like it's always going to take up the same height even when you apply a transform. And you can see that because on the accordion panel itself, I could add transform scale Y 0. But you see when I add that, it still takes up its full height. And that's why it's not actually sort of pushing stuff down. I think that's the important thing to get with an accordion is the feel of when you open a header, it pushes the other headers out of the way. I think that's the sort of thing that you can add to an accordion that makes it feel accordion-ish, if you will. Is you want that feeling of pushing stuff out of the way. I'm kind of like taking an accordion, if you will, like an accordion instrument, a musical instrument, and I'm pulling it apart in preparation to make that awful noise that accordions make. So that's the way you want to think about it when you're doing your styles for accordions. So I don't think transform is going to work. If you did do a transform, at the very least, might as well show you this. At the very least, you would want to set a transform origin, because right now, especially when it's slowed down, you can see it expands from the middle. And so it's pushing from the center to the top and to the bottom of that element during every animation. It's growing from the very center. So you could set a transform origin to make it transform from 50% on the x-axis, so from the center, but 0 on the y-axis. So it's going to do center top. And you'll see that changes it to actually grow from the top. So it looks like it's pushing down from the top, but it's still, we have that issue of the initial pop because this transform does not actually change the layout height. So that's not going to work. So let's not do this, and let's not do a transform on each of these. So what we could do instead is we could do basically a height animation. And unfortunately, you can't do like height 0, height 100 pixels. This doesn't really work because it will animate on the height property. So you'll see here, it animates, but first of all, you have this idea of overflow. So I would have to go back in and on each of these add overflow hidden. But then even when you do that, you can see here, what it's doing is it's animating the height to 100 pixels, but then it just flips back to its normal, because by default, as you can see this even more if I change this to like 150, you'll see here if we refresh and I push this out, it animates to 150, but then the element immediately goes back to its default height setting because it only has this keyframe height during the animation. So only for 0.3 seconds will it have a height of 0 and then a height of 1 and then a height of 2 all the way up to 150. But as soon as that 0.3 seconds is over, it goes back to its intrinsic height, which you can kind of inspect over here. If you go down to the height and the styles here, you'll see its intrinsic height is going to be, you can see it's grayed out because it's 85 pixels, but its actual height property in CSS is height auto. And unfortunately, what you can't do is you cannot do a keyframe animation from 0 to auto. That just doesn't work because you can't go from 0 to auto. There's no way for it to do keyframes. It's just not supported in browser. And so you'll see here that basically doesn't work. It starts out at 0, but then as soon as the animation is over, it goes right to auto. There's no keyframes in between. There's only 2 states there. So that does not work unless you were to do something like fix the height of the panel and then allow them to scroll within the panel. It's something I've seen some people do. In that case, you could do a height animation in CSS because then you would know the final value, right? You would say height is 200 pixels. So we're going to go from 0 to 200 pixels. But then you would want to make sure that your accordion panel itself, right here, always has a height of 200 pixels. Overflow Y is auto or something like that. So then you could do a height animation and it's going to work fine, right? It's not going to pop away or pop out afterwards. But the problem there is then if you have content that is really long, so like if we duplicate our thing here, you'll see you're going to have to scroll within here, which I think this is weird. I don't think users are going to love that idea of having a scroll bar within there. But again, it's something that I've seen people do, so that's totally up to you. But I don't like this. I think there's a better way. So let's take that out, and let's instead of doing a height animation here, what I generally like to do is I will do a min height animation, or sorry, no, not min height, max height. And max height is a little bit nicer because what it does is if you set a max height, the height of an element is still auto. You can leave auto there, but you can basically say, I want to set a max height and I'm going to do an animation from 0 to some value. So we could do 150 or 200 or whatever you want to do. And what that'll do is you'll still get that sort of height animation, but if an element is taller than that, then you'll see there at the end of the animation, it'll go back to auto, which I think is better because what you can do is you can set it to a reasonable height that's going to be good for like 80 to 90% of your accordion panels. And you kind of have to pick up the right value here. And you certainly, like in this case, I could set it up to like 400 or something to make it fit that first panel a little bit better. And that's going to look nicer. And it's going to be different for every application, right? So you need to pick what height works best for you, but it's going to allow the animation to work a lot better because you are again allowing auto height, but you're animating the max height property. And in our case, we know that most of our panels don't really need to go, especially if I refresh and we don't have those duplicated content, most of our panels don't need to go above 150, and that's going to work great in this specific scenario. And you could just say, well, you know what, let's set this to like a really, really big value, like 10,000 pixels. But in that case, the animation is going to be so fast, you're not even going to notice it. You're basically going to go back to like, you would have to to be able to see this, you would have to slow this down to like a 3-second animation. And that's going to be awful for the user to wait for because they're going to have to wait forever for that animation to actually finish on panels with a really large height. So it's good to kind of set this to a reasonable level. Like in this case, we'll do 150 over 0.3 seconds. So it'll do 50 pixels every 0.1 second, which I think is going to be a good rate for that animation. If we switch it back to 100%, you can sort of see it's got a fast feel to it, but you can still notice the animation, which is what I want. But even though that has been improved and we're still allowing for auto height on our elements, there's still a bit of a pop in here, especially if you slow it down to 10% of our animation here. Watch what happens. When I click, you immediately see the first sentence and then it sort of animates in. So why are we getting that initial pop in? Well, that's actually because our panels have a padding on it. So whenever you initially show its height, its max height is 0. So we're saying max height is 0, right? But this is what, and it's also, it has overflow hidden. So that's what we're seeing in the first keyframe is max height is 0. But what's happening is because of the padding is actually allowing this content to show up. So what we actually want is padding top 0 and padding bottom 0. And you'll see if all of those are in place on our keyframe, then it will actually be 0 height, and then we can keyframe up to the full height. So what we also want to do, and you can especially tell this in the animation inspector down here, if we come down here, you can see at the beginning of the animation, you have, let me find it up here. There we go. So at the beginning of the animation, you have 0 height. You can see over here in the inspector, it's 536 width by 0 height, but we're getting that extra height through the padding on the box model here. So we have 15 on the top, 25 on the bottom. And as we go through our keyframes here, you'll notice its height is starting to grow. Like in the middle of this, its height is like starting to grow a little bit. So it's like 67 pixels tall in this case, or 26 or whatever. But you know, the padding stays the same throughout. So the way we can fix that is we can basically also add a keyframe for padding top. It's going to start at 0. Padding bottom is going to start at 0. And we're going to end at, let me copy these. We're going to end at padding bottom is 25 pixels, padding top is 15 pixels. So we also went to transition on the padding for this to give it a nice smooth feel. And you'll notice here, now when I open it, look how smooth that animation is. And that's at 10%. So again, it's going to be much faster once we speed it back up. But now we have a nice smooth animation throughout this whole thing. And you can see that here, starting at 0, pushing it out, it's going to look much better. And this is the feel you want on your accordions. You want this feel of, let's push everything else out of the way. I'm interested in this content. And that's what you really want on your accordions. So let's go back to, make sure we go back to 100% and just kind of test this, see how that feels. You can see that has a much nicer feel to it. And it feels like an accordion. So there's still no exit animation on these. And I mentioned in previous videos that I don't like exit animations. I think it's fine when a user wants to dismiss something to just immediately have it disappear. And because we're doing a transition, you'll see you still get a nice little animation on the plus over here. So it's still kind of giving a bit of a transition to the user between those two states. But I think it's totally fine to not have an exit animation. As I mentioned, and they're hard to do. It's a little more advanced. So in a future lesson, I'll fit that in somewhere. I don't know where I'm going to do it, but I don't think I want to do it just yet because it's going to require us to like do some JavaScript and coding and all that stuff. And let's not get into that just yet because like I said, we're taking a break from JavaScript in this lesson. So no JavaScript allowed. But I think this feels much smoother now that we've added these animations, this grow in state. I'm much happier with our accordion. I think that's a great experience for our users. It's going to feel much better for the usability whenever people actually go in and use this. And hopefully you agree. So that's working great. That looks pretty awesome in my opinion. And I think we can now call our accordion done. And let's turn our attention back to the tabs that we created in the lesson before last, 2 lessons ago. We were working on our tabs. So let's also add a bit of animation. Normally tabs are something you don't necessarily have to animate, but I like to play around with this and make it as good as it can be. So what we'll do is we'll go back to our terminal. We'll hit Control-C. I'm going to hit up twice to go back to our normal npm run start. We'll go ahead and start up our index.html page so we can take a look at our tabs here. And like I said, normally you wouldn't necessarily need to do something with your tabs. You could certainly do something like add a transition to the color for the header. So very simply, I could go into tabs.sass. And on our anchor here, we could add a transition background color 0.3 seconds ease. So that would be a very simple transition. You see it just a little bit of a fade on the color there to ease the transition a bit. And that's okay. I think it's pretty normal for users to expect, like when you click on a tab, immediately show the panel. We don't need to do any sort of animation down here. I don't think that's necessary. The focus of any transition effects or animations that you want on tabs should be entirely on your tabs navigation on this area up here. And normally I don't think you would necessarily need to do anything. I might animate like the height to make something taller and make these smaller. That might be kind of a cool effect. So you could do, and again, that could just be a transition. So maybe when it's expanded, we can expand the padding. So right now our top padding is 10 pixels, our bottom padding is 5. So maybe when it's expanded, we could set padding to, 15 pixels, 15 pixels, 10 pixels. So we're going to add 5 to both the top and the bottom. So you see what that does. It makes it a little taller. And then, of course, we'll have to, I guess in the normal state, maybe we'll add margin top -5 pixels. Or no, actually, that's going to be 10 pixels. Right? So kind of push it up a little bit. And then all we'd have to do here is on our transition, let's add new transitions for margin top, 0.3 seconds ease, as well as padding, 0.3 seconds ease, like so. And then now you'll get a little bit of an animation on each of those, and that's looking pretty cool. I would say that's even a little overt. So maybe let's go from 10 to like 13 and 5 to 8. So let's ease that back down a little bit, and then that means we'll need to go -6 pixels. So that's a little better, I think. Again, subtlety is always key, in my opinion. I think that looks pretty nice there. We could even do something, I would say whenever you have tabs that only have icons, this is kind of an effect that I like to add, where when you click on the icon, you get a little shake, a little rock back and forth there. So we could create this fun animation that we could call, let's call it shake and bake. 90s folks, you know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you? So new keyframes, shake and bake. And from how do I want to do this? I think what we'll do is we'll do at 0% and 100%, we're going to transform, rotate 0 degrees. So at the beginning and the end of the animation, we want to go back to center, right? So that we have a nice transition to the end state. But then what we can do is we can kind of rock it back and forth. So maybe at like 20% we'll transform, rotate 10 degrees, 15 degrees maybe. And then at 40% we'll transform, rotate -15 degrees. And then when we get up to 60%, we'll go back to the right. And when we get up to 80%, we'll go back to the left. I don't know. Let's see if this works. We'll mess around with this a little bit. So you have the shake and bake keyframes that we just added. And now on our tabs, whenever we have an icon, let's see what our HTML setup is look like here. So we have an A and then a span inside of that. So whenever we have a expanded tab and we have a span inside it, let's add an animation on this for shake and bake, 0.3 seconds ease. Let's see what that looks like. It's not doing anything because I need to make sure it's display inline block, because transforms don't apply to inline elements. That way too much shaking. So you can see they kind of shake back and forth when you click on the icon. That's kind of fun, right? You wouldn't want to do this with text because it would make the text really hard to read. But if you just have an icon, or like in this case, we're using emojis, let's make that way more subtle. Maybe like half of that. We'll do like 6 or 7 degrees. Let's see what that looks like. That looks better. So just a little bit of a shake. I would even slow this down 0.5 seconds because it's not like really making the content move. 0.4 seconds, something like that. That's looking much better. Cool. So we added just a little bit of an indication. Almost feels like when you click on the broccoli or you tap it, you're like kind of rocking it back and forth a little bit, right? It just makes that interaction feel more impactful by adding a little bit of secondary animation on an element, it sort of occurs after the touch or the tap or the click actually occurs. And I think this works well with icons. You can kind of make your icons rock a little bit. Again, it draws attention to it. It's saying, hey, you just clicked on this. It just makes that feel a lot more impactful. And I like that effect whenever you have tabs with this sort of thing. And you could, of course, always mess with the timing of these. I think especially for the transition on the margin top and the padding that kind of causes the tabs to grow a little bit. We can mess around with that and maybe have it do something like this. And let's copy that cubic Bezier function, add it to the margin top and the padding, and see what that looks like. It's almost imperceptible, so we should probably make that a little more overt. Maybe do something like this. And let's copy that one, and paste that into each of these. See what that looks like. And our linter doesn't like the 0 dot, so we'll take the 0 dot out. There we go. So it's kind of hard to see there, but if we open our animation pane, it's pretty subtle, but you'll notice it grows and then it comes back a little bit. It's probably not, I don't know if I love that because it's a little jumpy looking when you slow it down. Maybe we just go back to ease in that situation. Maybe that's not a good candidate for the bounciness thing. So let's go back to 100%. We'll find another opportunity to add some bounciness to this. Cool. So we added some tabs animation, totally optional. You definitely don't necessarily need to do this. And then the last thing I want to do to sort of improve our Hangry Prints application, now that we've added some cool animation to both the accordions and the tabs, is let's take a look at this little guy. This guy that we've ignored this whole time. All this time we've spent on Hangry Prints, and we didn't even mess with this. You didn't even think about this, did you? We're looking at our menu at this point. So let's improve the menu as well. I think menus are something that you're going to have on like most, or if not all, of your applications. If you don't have a menu, it's probably because you have a super simple like single page application or something, but you're going to see this very commonly. Some sort of menu, and in a lot of cases you have a menu that sort of pops out like this, a menu that's hidden, and you click on a menu button. You could call this a hamburger button, if you will, whatever you want to call it, but you have this idea of a menu button and it reveals a menu. So first of all, in this case, the menu almost has a style where it's, you could call this an off-canvas menu, where you have this menu that kind of slides in from the left, and rather than having it immediately pop in, I don't think that's very effective in this case. We could very simply, on our menu that is right here, it has some styles on it that are coming from, as you can see here, menu.sass, menu.scss. We could add an animation to it, so rather than popping in, maybe we want it to slide in from the left, and that's really easy to add. In our effects.sass, let's go down here and let's add slide in, and we'll do a keyframes, of course, for slide in. It's going to go from 0% margin left negative 100% to 100% margin left 0. Oh, and you know what? I should do a transform, not a margin left. What am I thinking? So we'll do, in both of these cases, translate X between those two keyframes. So that's going to translate between negative 100% of its width on the x-axis to, and then a translate, it just moves stuff around without changing its normal rendering box model. So then we'll add slide in down here, animation, slide in 0.3 seconds ease, something like that. And then now that we've created this utility effect class, let's go into, we're not working in support right now, we're actually working in index.html. We'll go into our menu, div with a class of menu, and we'll just add slide into that. And you'll see here, we now get a nice little, hey, look at me, I just slid in from the left. That looks much better, in my opinion. So again, that's a pretty easy effect. You just do the transform translate X, and you could do 100% to 0, negative 100% to 0. That's going to create a nice little, again, it's like what you would call an off-canvas menu style, where the menu is currently, it's off the canvas. I can't see it, but as soon as I click on this, it's going to say, hey, look at me, and it slides into view, which I think is going to be a much nicer sort of entry on that particular element. All right, and finally, we're going to flex our CSS chops. And we're gonna make this menu icon awesome. We're gonna do some fun stuff with it. Let me find a link. I have a link somewhere of a bunch of menu icons. Hamburger icon animations. I forget how I found that. Yes, Jonathan Suh. This is awesome. So check this out, guys. I will post a link to this in the video description down below. This is called Hamburgers. It's animations for hamburger menus. Some people call this the hamburger menu, this 3 lines thing. Usability says that it's probably not a good icon to use for menus, but it's so ubiquitous now on so many apps and websites that I think people are getting used to it. But the idea is you have, generally with a hamburger menu or a menu that you're going to toggle on and off, you have this idea of toggling it between 2 states. And so Jonathan has created some really awesome animations that you can copy and paste into your solution if you would like. But it's basically just CSS animated hamburgers, and you can see he has very simple sliders. There's all sorts of ways you could do this, but you basically go from like a hey, open the menu state to a hey, close the menu state. And that's the idea with this hamburger menu, is you have lots of different ways you could do this, and Jonathan's created some pretty awesome animations, as you could see here, which you can just go and copy. You can see there he's definitely using some cubic Bezier timing to create some cool bounciness on that. There's some really awesome examples of this. So definitely check that out. I think it's worth just sort of looking through it. As you can see, like these icons just feel so much like they feel fun. They feel exciting and really interactive. And again, it gives you that impact when you're clicking, that feeling of impact that, whoa, I really did something. So I'm not going to copy and paste this for now. We're actually going to implement our own, but I want to do the same sort of thing where we have our 3 lines and we're going to animate those into some state that's going to allow us to turn it into an X or a minus. I don't know what we're going to do, but we're going to mess with it. So it's awesome and it's fun. So let's go into our menu.sas file. And first of all, let's look how those are working at the moment. So if you go down to the very bottom of this, there's this menu icon. And you can see it's in the HTML, it's just some spans is all it is. So you have this span class equals menu icon, and it has these span class equals line. So it's got 3 line spans in it. And then in our CSS, we're setting a top border to white and display block, and that's actually what makes the 3 lines show up. But what's really cool is now that we have this, we can kind of mess around with a style, and we can apply a transform to these lines so that whenever we are expanded or we're in an aria expanded equals true state, then we can apply an animation or a transform, or I guess you would call it a transition, to those lines so we can kind of move them around and do stuff with them, which I think is a pretty cool effect. So what we'll do is after at the bottom of this menu icon block here, we will add aria expanded equals true space ampersand. So that's going to say when you have a menu icon that is inside of something that has an aria expanded equals true attribute, then let's override the styles that we had up here. So what we can say is, just like we did up here with our dot line, we can say when you have a dot line inside of our menu icon, let's take the first line, or let's do nth child 1. Nth child is a way to select the nth child. I think this is an awful, whoever in the CSS spec came up with nth child, like, come on, that is so hard to say. Why is that the term for the, you could do like EQ, that would have been nice, or like N of 1, like how easy is that to write? But no, we have to do nth child. That's crazy. Or even just, if you really like that term child, why not just child 1? That would have been so much nicer. But no, we have to use this weird format of nth child, which I think confuses a lot of people. But anyway, so you have nth child, one. So we're basically saying the first one, and you can see how this works. I can say border top color is danger or something like that. And when we say this, you'll see when it's expanded, we're kind of overriding just the first line. That's what we're doing with this selector here. But what we can do instead of overriding it is we can do something like transform it. And usually the way I do this when I'm working on these really intricate animations is I might mess around with it in the browser first. So we can just go in here and add a transform. First of all, let's like rotate it 45 degrees. So you can see there when you rotate, you can sort of see how that animation is going to look. If you look at the line up there, I'm just using the shift key and going up and down. But we're going to rotate it up to 45 degrees to create half of our X. But obviously it's in the wrong position here. So we're also going to need to, you could do like a translate to move it. Or what I do a lot of times with this is I'll do a transform origin. And so we want to transform on the x-axis from the left, so that's going to be 0, and on the y-axis from the bottom, or 100%. So that'll actually have it transform from the bottom left of it. So you'll see now, if you kind of watch the line, it's actually pivoting from the bottom left when you apply a rotate transform to it. So that's nice because it kind of gets it close to the center of our icon. It's not quite there, so we probably also want to add a translate. And then translate is basically going to be 2 values like this. And I honestly, when things are rotated, this gets weird. I'm sure somebody could do some math to figure out exactly the value, but I just mess with it, to be honest. I just kind of, I highlight the icon so you can see the highlighted box up here. And I just kind of mess with it until I get about to the center of that area. And you can see it looks like a translate 2 and -2 works pretty well for that. So using a combination of these two things, we can now copy this into our CSS. We'll do a transform on the nth child 1. So we're going to rotate it 45 degrees and do a translate. But I want to also make sure we have the transform origin, which I will set, I guess we could set it right here. So let's see what that looks like at this point. Let me refresh to get rid of our dev tool stuff I was doing here. And then I need to do a transition. So up here we'll do transition on the transform, 0.3 seconds ease. So now let's see what that looks like. I think we probably want to move this transform origin thing because it's only being applied when aria expanded is true. I think that's why we're getting that jump when it looks good when you activate it, but when you deactivate it, you see it goes back to transform origin center. So we need to add up here actually nth child 1 transform origin that. So it's always applied even when you are transitioning off or you're deactivating that state. And now you see we get a nice transition between those two states. So we're moving that first line down and just basically repeat the process. So what we want to do is I want the last one to rotate up. So what we'll do is on this one is first of all, we'll set the transform origin of the third line to be, I want it to rotate, let's see, how do I want to do this? I want to rotate down from here and I rotate up from there, which means I want the transform origin to be at the top left of that. So that'll be 0, 0. So 0 on the X and 0 on the Y will be the top left corner for the transform origin of the third line. And then what we'll do is we'll duplicate this down here. We'll take our third line, we'll rotate it -45 degrees, and then I'm going to have to mess with the translate again because math is hard. So I'd rather just mess with it. You can see it's kind of off. So we'll have to mess with the third line's translate, and it's looks like maybe just moving, yeah, that looks about center right there, doesn't it? So maybe just moving that second value to +2. Well, that looks like it's about centered. So we'll just remove the negative here. And now you can sort of see that nice animation that we're getting where we're removing the lines to form an X. And now let's just take the middle one. So this is going to be nth child 2. Nth child. I hate nth child. That's awful. Transform We could scale it down, but let me just scale it on the x-axis to 0. I think this will look kind of cool. So you can see it just kind of shrinks. And let's slow our animations down to 25% so you can really see that animation. You can see that's looking pretty cool. I think that's a nice little animation. It turns into an X. And that's all there is to it, guys. That's pretty cool, right? Definitely want some springiness to this. I told you guys we were going to bring that back. So let's go to our transition here. Let's mess with our timing function to do something that's real springy. So let's bring that like this. Let's see what that looks like. Ooh, yeah, that's some springiness there, isn't there? That looks pretty cool when it's slowed down. Let's look at it at 100% as well. I want to make sure it doesn't look awful. Yeah, that's pretty cool. So we added some springiness to it. I would say maybe even that's too far up. So let's bring it back to more like this. There we go. A little more subtle there. Slow down the animation. I think I mentioned before, I could sit here all day and like mess with these animations, but I'm not going to put you guys through that. So let's move on. So let's come up here. I'll change the transform to cubic Bezier that we created inside of the DevTools. And let's take a look at our awesome new animation for our icon. And our application is pretty fun at this point. I think we did some cool stuff in this lesson. We added some animations. We didn't even touch the JavaScript, but we made our accordion feel so much better. We made our tabs a little better in terms of adding some shake and bake to the icons. And we added some animation state on our menu. And as you can see, if you sort of compare the before and after, I think you'll see the value of spending some time on the presentation inside of your applications. It's such an important part of interactivity in any web application. So hopefully you found some value in this, had some fun adding some CSS. I think this is working great at this point. So thanks for watching. In the next lesson, we'll move on to something entirely new and start to learn some new stuff now that we've completed our Hangry Prints application.